three representatives that are here participating in this dialogue on just transition, the Parliamentary Observatory on Climate Change. I would like to greet the representatives of Bolivia, Senator Jack Starkner of the Environment Committee, and Senator Gladys Gonzalez, President of the Commission on the Environment of Argentina. Likewise, I would like to greet the panel members. Dr. Marcelo Barreiro from Uruguay. He's professor of science of the School of Sciences of Uruguay. Dr. Mercedes Bustamante from Brazil. She's professor of the Brasilia University. And Dr. Virginia Villarino. She's the coordinator of the Business Council of Argentina for Sustainable Development. She is there for more than 15 years. On behalf of ECLAC, I would like to welcome all those who are with us in this event that is Parliamentary Observatory on Climate Change, Just Transition in Latin America. I remind you there is simultaneous interpretation. You can click on your language, Portuguese, Spanish, or English. And on the lower part of your screen, you have a globe, and there you click, and the language. It's exactly on the lower part of the as I said, there is simultaneous interpretation, and you can access to it. Well, this event is of great significance. It begins with a dialogue that has already taken place elsewhere, but this is the first time we do it between the Parliamentary Observatory on Climate Change, academia, and parliamentary members. The idea is to show scientific evidence about proposals so that Parliament may then know how can we adapt to mitigate climate change. I now have the honor to invite Cecilia Riquena, Senator, representative of the Senate of Bolivia, and she will be addressing you with the opening remarks. Then Senator Wagner, President of the Environment Committee of the Senate of Brazil, will address you, welcoming you to this session. Dr. Cecilia Requena. Thank you. First, I would like to greet each one of the members. I will not mention each one. I have a very short time to greet. So I just want to thank all the attendants and also panel members, and thank you very much for being here in this very important step. As Carlos Musi said, this connection, linking all this body of democratic representations and science. We need public policies to be science-based. And this communication needs to be more fluent, to be something of every single day. And here we are contributing precisely to that path forward within the framework of the observatory. Also, I would like to greet the persons of ECLAC and thank them for their support, for all the support. 3 ideas. 1, it is very important to understand the relationship between the enormous challenges raised by climate change, as well as the loss of biodiversity, deforestation, and others for our countries that are among the most vulnerable ones, especially certain societies. And without democracy, we won't be able to adequately address and respond to these enormous challenges that are added to others that still are pending in other countries. And democracy, first, for our countries to democratically express the ideas, proposals, and criticism from territories. They are sacrificed territories, and it's impossible for that to be adequately expressed if we don't have a rule of law, a democracy allowing for those views. And also, democracy, we representatives of democracy honored by citizens to be their representatives, we have the obligation not only to listen but to translate their views into proposals that are science-based, something very important, something inevitable. And therefore we have the honor to have scientists here that will illustrate and provide us with their knowledge. Also, I would like to say that multi-level cooperation is key, and it needs to be from the planet perspective, going to the regional perspective, and international, national perspectives. Inside the countries, also the different levels of subnational governments. And in each government, sometimes we have a difficulty to connect the executive branch with the legislative or municipal governments, or sometimes different ministries in one same government. So challenges are many. We need to address them. And this event tries to contribute in a very concrete manner to that need of multi-level articulation, connection. Finally, it's very important to comply with access to information for the people, for citizens. And with that, we are complying with the Escazú agreement that has been ratified by my country and many others here. It's so important. We are complying. We are fulfilling our role. A lot needs to be done still, but it's always good to give some first steps. And as we were saying a few moments ago, the idea is to continue to strengthen these connection processes among legislative powers or branches, which are, and academia. Thank you very much. Welcome all, and hope this is going to be a success.
Fluidez de informação.
We would like to thank you for that very fluid information. I also have to congratulate environmental defenders and everything that is related to the Escazú agreement. I would like to offer the floor now to Jack Feiner, who is the president of the Environment Commission of the Brazilian Senate. Thank you very much, Carlos Musi. And I would likewise like to congratulate everyone that has supported PCC. And I would also like to greet Cecilia from Bolivia, President of the Environment Commission, as well from Brazil, who is my counterpart, and Mercedes Bustamante, who has already made a tremendous contribution to us in the General Forum, and likewise Edson Ramirez, who is with us here today. No, Marcelo, sorry. And I imagine that Virginia is not with us yet. Gladys is with us here, and I would like to quickly say to you that I believe that that meeting is fundamental between policy operators and our colleagues from academia. These are very important aspects. We are at a moment of contributing to each other. because I believe, and repeating what Senator Cecilia has already mentioned, Cecilia does not coexist with extreme poverty and with exclusion. In fact, those that wish to degrade either the economy, uh, creating greater problems in social aspects, the end of the protection network, or in the environmental arena, destroying and denying all the reports on that issue to date. And therefore, they always seek to create antagonism and a dichotomy between development, inclusion, and preservation. And we see that permanently here in the Senate and in the Chamber of Deputies of Brazil. My sadness yesterday in the Agriculture and Agrarian Reform Commission was very big because we read a report called a report that will be voted on next week, and the president of the Senate will participate in the Environment Commission, but we have not yet had that because the Senate here is very presidentialist in nature. I say this because I do not find that interaction and the volume of interaction is the best way in which that we have in order to escape this false dichotomy in terms of preservation and development. Those that want to work with this dichotomy, I don't know if it's us or in politics or those in academia, well, we have to build a route, a way to escape from that dichotomy, and thus provide congressmen and women and society as a whole with objective and scientific information about what is happening from at a planetary and environmental level. I believe that that will probably be the best tool, the best weapon that we may have in order to face up to that. I would like to thank this contribution, this support provided by panelists that are present here, by the Environmental Commission of the Senate, and today I am here to listen rather than to speak. We politicians like microphones, but now I will work more with my ears and benefit from your knowledge. Thank you very much. Thank you, Senator Jack Wagner. Now, we would like to begin our presentations that will be delivered by our panelists who are professors, researchers, PhD holders, and that form part of Ipcc, which is a UN initiative to provide knowledge to different issues. And today we have the possibility of having several representatives from South America with us. And so that is the objective. As I already mentioned, the idea is to talk about that and to hold a debate between science, legislation, and what is possible in terms of prioritizing society and how we can also protect the planet. We must also abide by all the global agreements and the Paris Agreement, certainly. And that shows how wide-ranging this climate change initiative is. So it's a more pure science and related to a change in the behavior of society. Now I would like to offer the floor to Dr. Marcelo Barreiro from the University of Uruguay. He holds a PhD in oceanography, and he's also a master's in physics from the University of the Republic in Uruguay. And he also obtained a Bachelor of Physics from that same university and is a full professor at the Department of Atmospheric Sciences of the Faculty of Sciences of the University of the Republic. For 3 years, he has worked in IPCC working groups and produced the latest report on the state of knowledge of the physical basis of climate change, which was published in August 2021. So, Dr. Marcelo, who is also a lecturer, Dr. Marcelo Barreiro, you have 20 minutes for your presentation. Thank you very much.
Buenos días a todos.
Good morning, everyone. I hope you can see my screen properly. First of all, I would like to express my gratitude to the organizers for inviting me to such an important event where we will be able to discuss and exchange. These are communities that are sometimes very separate when we talk about academia and the legislative sectors.
Senador Wagner, seu microfone está aberto. Desculpe, professor.
Não, só para saber se eles querem, porque aí se eu não puder ir,
Senador,
aí eu mando alguém pegar e falar,
el
entendeu?
equipo de STIC, si
Aquí
pueden
vamos
por
ficar vendo
favor
aqui, vai ter
mutear
outra
el
hora
micrófono
também.
del senador. Gracias.
Bueno, muy bien, gracias. Bueno, como les comentaba,
Okay, as I mentioned, I was expressing my gratitude for being able to participate in this type of event, which is very positive for our countries that have been impacted by climate change. And if we do nothing, clearly they will be even more impacted with upcoming changes. In this discussion, what I would like to present to you is are the results of the first volume of the Ipcc report, which dealt with the scientific basis of the physics of climate change. And I would like to share with you, first of all, some results that we obtained at a global level, so that then we can go down to the scale of the Latin American continent. And subsequently, my colleagues, the other panelists, the idea is for them to deal with a more regional scale within Latin America. So I am not going to dwell on specific countries or on specific regions of our continent. To begin with, I believe that the first thing that we have to be clear on, and perhaps many of us are aware of this, but it's worthwhile highlighting this, is that one of the fundamental conclusions of the Ipcc is that it is undoubtedly human influence has increased the temperature of the global climate change from the pre-industrial era, and what is very probable is that greenhouse gases have been responsible for this warming since the late 70s. And that warming, as from the pre-industrial era and to date, is close to a value of 1.3 degrees to date. So these are values for global temperature. Undoubtedly, there is no doubt about human influence upon climate, and we know that we have been the biggest responsible party for this warming. When we look at the map that represents the increase in temperature from the 60s to date, you can see that all continents are in red, and that means that practically all continents have warmed up. I would like to focus on Latin America, as I said. At the level of the Ipcc, we broke down this continent into different regions, as you can see on the left-hand side of the image. And perhaps my other colleagues will focus on each one of these sub-regions, but I would like to speak about the continent as a whole. Now, what is the mean temperature in Latin America from Tierra del Fuego and up until Mexico? Well, we can see there the average evolution as from 1850 and to date. And this is the line in black that you can see on the graph. And what we find is that climate change signals in terms of temperature for the continent as a whole began to be evidenced as from the 50s, roughly. And in around 1990, the evolution of the continent's temperature completely broke away from what could have been expected if human action had not had such a tremendous influence on climate change. The green line on the bottom is the evolution and that of the continent's temperature in the absence of human impact upon climate. And the line in orange is
debido a la acción humana.
Very close to the line in black. So you can see that as from the 90s, the two curves have been very different. And if one uses the climatic influence created by man, such as greenhouse gases or the emissions of industry, it is possible to recover the evolution observed in the black curve in Latin America. And therefore, clearly, the climate change signal at the level of average or medium temperature in Latin America can no longer be explained if one does not take into consideration the effect of human activity on this. Now, let's have a look at extremes, because normally when one talks about climate change, we say, okay, average temperature changes in a continent, in a country, or in the region, but the day-to-day level is also very important. And one often feels climate change via specific extreme daily events, either related to temperature or to rainfall. And therefore, one of the conclusions of the report is that in terms of temperature, in terms of extremes of temperature, it is eventually true, and this is perhaps the most certain, the most truthful category of the Ipcc in terms of certainty, that greenhouse gases are the main promoters of changes that have been observed in both cold and warm extremes in most continents. And therefore, in terms of temperature, extremes have an important component associated to the human impact upon the climate.
As to rainfall, the results are a bit different. And it is likely that human influence, especially greenhouse gas emissions, be the most important cause intensifying intense rainfall events. That is, today, based on what we have observed globally, it is easier to ascribe changes of extreme temperatures, and it's more difficult to ascribe changes in extreme rainfall events to human action. That is, when we speak about rainfall, it's one detects the changes, but it's more difficult to ascribe, attribute those changes to human action, different from the temperature, where extreme temperatures have been affected by climate change. What are the observed changes at continent level? And this is what I meant to say before. If you see the warm extreme temperatures, for example, Latin American continent is divided in hexagons. Each one of the hexagons is a region indicated on the map here on top at the left. If you see the warm extremes, you see that in almost all the continent of Latin America, there has been an increase. That is maximum temperature in the year. Some can be the minimum temperatures during the day or heat waves So in almost all of the continent, there has been an increase of warm extreme temperatures. And these dots, black dots, show the confidence you have in ascribing the human effect on these changes. Many of them have 2 or 3 dots, almost all. That means that there is a high confidence in ascribing, a high or medium confidence in ascribing this to human action. Now, if you see intense rainfall, the view is a bit different, the outlook, because it's difficult to associate changes in rainfall to human action. So you see the different regions here of South America, or Latin America, that is, and what you can observe is that many regions, large majority of the continent, is difficult to observe a specific change, except in the southeast South America. Here it would be in the south of Brazil, Uruguay, Argentina, and a bit of Paraguay, showing an increase in rainfall, intense rainfall, that is, and there is some type of certainty in linking that increase to human action. And if you go to droughts, now we are speaking about long-term climate phenomena, what you can observe once again is that there is no clear change at the level of all the continent in these big regions. Perhaps in small ones, yes, but in the big ones, no, except in the northeast of South America, that would be this region here, where there has been an increase in the number of droughts, and there is some type of certainty or link to human action. These are the observed changes in different extremes in Latin America. What happens with the future forecast? What can we expect? I will show you forecasts not based on a specific socioeconomic scenario. There are several used by Ipcc, but what is shown here is changes in some variables for different levels of global warming. That is, the map on the left is there is 1.5 degrees global warming in the average temperature of the planet. Today, we are in 1.1, so we are close to 1.5 global warming. The second map is for 2 degrees of global warming, and the last one is for 4 degrees centigrade of global warming. What does the map show? Well, these are the changes in the maximum annual temperature at each one of these levels of warming. What we can see is that in the continent, the maximum annual temperature increases, and as global warming is greater, the maximum annual temperature at the level of the continent is ever greater, and that maximum annual temperature increases much more than the global warming level. For example, for 2 degrees of an average global warming, what you can see is that on this central part of South America, we are having an increase of the maximum annual temperature close to 3 or 4 degrees, right? This is for maximum annual temperature. Now, what happens in rainfall? This is the same, but now to consider how, according to climate models, how annual accumulated rainfall would change in each one of the levels, each one of the areas. As global warming increases, the changes observed in rainfall are ever greater. An example, for example, if we go to intermediate 2-degree global warming, there are two regions where rainfall would increase in Latin America. One southeast of South America, and the other one is the northeastern coast of North America. And there would be other regions where there would be a decrease. It would be Chile, north of South America, and Central America. Now, the pattern in the three figures is more or less the same, except that changes in rainfall are ever more intense as global warming is ever higher or greater. This is annual accumulated rainfall. What happens if you focus on the extremes? Now, one of the things that happens if rainfall changes during the year, also the way we don't keep the form or way in which rainfall days are distributed throughout the year also changes. And this can be seen on this table or figure. Here, if we see the index, which is maximum 5 days accumulated rainfall. And what can you observe is that in all of the South American continent, except in Chile, the maximum 5 days accumulated rainfall increases beyond the fact that there are some regions where the annual accumulated rainfall decreases. This means that rainfall is more concentrated in certain days and are not that distributed throughout the year. And that idea can be reinforced if you see consecutive dry days. For example, in this area, in this of the Amazonia, Brazil, Bolivia, what you can see is that the number of consecutive dry days increases or would increase in the future with global warming. So if we compare this figure with this other one, there will be a greater accumulation for 5 days, consecutive days, like would say like waves of rainfall, and separated from distance from little rainfall. We will have extreme rainfall days, but this separated by many dry days. Our continent is surrounded by oceans, and therefore it's key for us to know what will happen in our sea coasts, in our jurisdictional waters, economic exclusive zones, what will happen in the oceans. This figure shows that it is extremely likely that human influence has been the most important driver of the increase of warmth content in the ocean. That is, oceans have absorbed 90% of the extra energy we have placed in, absorbed by the ocean, and that continues to be an increase in the content of heat. That is, the temperature of water of the ocean will increase. We are saying that the ocean has 4 kilometers depth. We are warming all of the water column, and that has an importance in many aspects. But one that I would like to highlight is that what is expected is that in the future, the number of marine heat waves around Latin America will increase. What's that? Well, the land warm zones, it's the same, but at the level of the temperature in the ocean surface. There are several days, several weeks where the temperature surface of the water is above the usual, and that is ecologically important, has an importance on the marine life, and especially in all that is related to fisheries. So the other important factor, which is key for our coastlines, is at the level of the sea. And as I was saying before, the ocean has absorbed 90% of the extra energy that mankind has placed on the earth, and that has made the ocean to warm and expand. The level of the sea increases, and the other component of the level of the sea has to do with the melting of polar ice caps or glaciers. So what's very likely is that human influence has been the most important driver for the increase in the sea level observed, which is more than 3 millimeters per year. This increase of sea level is the most important driver for that is human action. And as we can see around Latin America and the sea level, what we find is that compared with the global increase of the ocean, the sea level has increased at a higher pace in the South Atlantic and northern subtropical Atlantic, and at a lower level or pace in the Eastern Pacific Ocean. And the other thing we know is that it's extremely likely that the increase of the sea level will continue to contribute to coastline floods in lower areas and retraction of the coastline. There is an enormous inertia there. It's difficult to warm it. It's very big, a lot of water, and therefore changes that start to happen in the ocean are difficult to stop. So the sea level height will continue to increase for the coming decades, hundreds of years, although we stop emitting greenhouse gases today, because it's already a process that has or occurs in a very slow pace. What we need to do is try to reduce that increase at the sea level, limiting to the maximum the emissions of greenhouse gases. But there are changes that can no longer be stopped. What we can do is decrease the pace at which they occur and the maximum intensity of them, and the level of the sea is one of them. And then finally,
I would like to also highlight in this presentation the fact that our whole continent is strongly impacted by the El Niño phenomenon, with a southern oscillation. That is one of the most important variables at a world level, and especially at an interannual scale that generates or leads to anomalies in terms of rainfall and so on. And there are also other climatic variabilities. The Ipcc report studied whether human influence had impacted these variability models or teleconnections. In other words, the impact generated at a regional level. And what we found is that in principle, human influence has not yet impacted these variability models. And especially for the El Niño phenomenon, what we find is that there is little confidence on the fact that human activity has had an influence upon the changes observed in the El Niño phenomenon, especially in the sense that there are two types of El Niño phenomenon, which is called central or eastern. And those changes that have been observed with regards to this phenomenon, there is little, we don't really believe that this has been impacted or the result of human activity. And I would also like to highlight in this presentation that the IPCC report is very clear by saying that recent climate changes are generalized, fast and increasingly intense, and specifically that they have no precedent in thousands of years. That is a very important message if one studies climate, and especially climate change. What one does is to compare what is observed today with the climate in the past. And therefore, this is one of the disciplines or sub-disciplines, which is a study of past climates and how that would compare to the present climate. And what we find is that the changes that we are observing have no precedence in the past thousands of years. And it also highlights that it is undeniable that human activities are causing climate change. And if we do not decarbonize our economies, these changes will be increasingly more significant. And this is where I would like to end. Thank you very much. And I am open to answer any questions. Thank you, Marcelo, for your discussions. This is a very wide-ranging summary of all the physical aspects that are impacting climate, and we are concerned, especially concerned with your final words, because there is no precedent, and most of that is due to human action. Therefore, we have to change the basis of our economies, as you also mentioned. I would like to highlight the presence of Deputy Rodrigo Agostinho, and I hope that his presentation will also be shared on the screen. And through the deputy, I would like him to already start thinking about the questions that we will be asking Congressman Senator Jack Wagner and Senator Requena, so that we can have. I now like to offer the floor to Dr. Mercedes Bustamante, who will indeed refer to something that was very clear on Professor Marcelo's maps, which is the impact of climate change, both on the Amazon and on the plains of southern Latin America, of South America. So we will be working on that. She already worked on the different assessments, and she introduced all the IPCC modifications. And in the first evaluation on the intergovernmental platform for diversification of services, Professor Mercedes, you have 20 minutes for your presentation. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I would like to greet all the senators that are present, Senator Wagner and Senator Requena, who have already made use of, who have already spoken to you. The first part of the presentation is very clear, I believe. The next slide. I would like to begin, or I would like to continue where Marcelo ended, in the sense that human influence has promoted climate warming in an unprecedented manner. And these are all the reports that were mentioned with regards to the mean temperature, which in increase in approximately 1.1 degrees over and above pre-industrial levels. We have had a whole series of extreme events in terms of storms, droughts, and a whole series of events in different parts of the country, of the world, and those climate changes therefore are associated to climate variability and the presence of extreme meteorological events. Here we have an image that Marcelo has already shared with us, but I would like to highlight here that our region in Central America and South America, as Marcelo has already mentioned, this is regional, this comes from regional reports of our regions, and it shows the high temperatures in our region, and we find higher temperature events with the results that we're already aware of. Something that I feel is important and that should be highlighted, and that is also present in the reports, and now especially in the previous report, for example, the Ipcc. Let's see, what would an increase of 1.5 degrees imply, and how could we leave that at that level? Soon we will be reaching an increase of 1.5 degrees in the 2030 to 2050 period. And we have tried to reduce that temperature. And the critical point of the report is that the period in which we would reach 1.5%, and that was brought forward in a decade, and therefore we will probably reach that level of 1.5 degrees in early 2030s, and therefore the speed of warming, of reaching that 1.5 degrees, implies a difficulty. And what we find on this table is that we find different models that we have worked on. And the place where this would be most accelerated is 1.4. And we have different points, and I would like to, where mitigations are more accentuated and robust, and therefore we will probably reach that level in the next decade. Indeed, we are reaching 2 and 3, and that increase means that we will end up by having temperatures over and above 1.5. And therefore, what we find in the literature is extremely important, because this implies an increase in temperature. Marcelo already showed these graphs that again illustrate these differences. The changes of 1 degree and 1.5 degrees. This will rely heavily on ocean temperatures. What we are able to observe in these figures is the increase of mean temperature related to the Industrial Revolution period, and with we can observe the central part. We see an increase of between 2 and 4 degrees, and we have a record of temperature increases in this area of South America. Here we see the Amazon area and the area of other areas in South America, and that is very important when we look at soil humidity, which is illustrated in the bottom map. So you can see there the variation in soil humidity, and to the extent that we find more colors in brown, that is an increase in a drop in soil humidity. And so we can see there that the soil humidity is unable to support a tropical forest, and that indeed will imply far greater problems, especially in the areas of plains with the main vegetable formations in South America. Here we find another important point. And we find natural, social, and economic vulnerabilities. And each increase in temperature implies an increase in the frequency of events. So we move from an increase of 1 to 1.5. That means that we will have, in 10 years' time, we will see an increase of 2.8. Which, as we can see on the screen, and after that we have a frequency, and we would be reaching expected warming levels, and therefore every 50 years that would become much more frequent, and these scenarios, these warming events would become much more frequent. The same thing happens with rainfall. I would like to highlight the issue of the drought that impacts regions. And we also have to include Brazil in this picture. And so here I will again mention what Senator Wagner has already mentioned. We have to make decisions today. We have to decide that we have to struggle against poverty before climate change. And we have to deal with that 2 points in a joint manner and not in an isolated fashion, because climate change amplifies crises and threats. Marcelo showed this figure where we focus on the subregions in Central America and South America. And what we can see here in the reports is that the average temperatures have probably increased far more than in other subregions. And they will also increase at a higher rate than the global average. And that will have a tremendous impact upon South American systems, where we will expect summer rainfalls, monsoons, and drought periods will be longer lasting, and we will probably have less rainfall. And in this sense, we can expect more rainfall to make agriculture in countries sustainable, and therefore this impacts northeastern Brazil. We will therefore find an increase of droughts, and something that also happens as a result. And as a result of that, what will also happen is wildfires, and we have to try to prevent that. Here we see the summary of the impact of climate change, the impact on vulnerability. And in this chart, I have highlighted the different impacts in the different regions of Latin America, in the South American region. And in accordance with the size of the circles, we will see the size of the impact. And in yellow, in orange, the impact on earth areas and environmental services. And we expect that in the northeastern region of the central region and in the southern part of South America, a very large impact that we expect in terms of the quality of the ecosystem and the degradation of natural environments and aquatic systems. Here we find an impact that we're already evidencing, and which is the degradation in Central and South America, and the columns represent changes in terrestrial freshwater and ocean systems, changes in distribution patterns over time, and therefore the two columns are the structures of ecosystems. And we already observe impacts in ecosystems in our region. And so these are the consequences that we already evidence in our day-to-day activities. And we have all the central area for 2021, which was the country when we reached the lowest level of rainfall in this century, and that forced the government to ration energy, which had a tremendous impact upon the population.
Desses vários riscos, né? Então, quando a gente fala que a crise climática
It's very important where Ipcc converges, and climate change is one of the things that Ipcc says we won't be able to address or approach these risks in an isolated manner. Everybody has to be united. All these events are accelerating the climate variability and temperature rise. And once again, we have several connections with what happens every day. Last year, we see a sample of how several states were affected, like São Paulo, Minas Gerais, Mato Grosso. And this is important. Why does this affect economic activity in São Paulo? The many fires. There are many problems with energy and the impact on the population. Also, the biomass, fires, And the smoke, for example, closed the Porto Velho airport for 1 hour, and many others had to be closed because of the large amount of smoke. And finally, last year also, we saw multiple risks here, drought and fires in this sector of Brazil, the lack of vegetation and all the dust, suspension dust that of course causes damage to the population in addition to the smoke closing airports. And we unfortunately continue in this situation. Shortly ago, we saw that the Amazonia has a record rate of fires since 2007. And in Cerrado, it's the highest since 2010. We've seen extreme events, but there is always like a routine in these fires in the Amazon. And here we will see the results of the working group and what are the solutions? What can we do to fight this impact? And this report begins with an important message. In spite of all the accumulated knowledge and in spite of the evidence of the impact of climate change on our society, from 2010 to 2019 brought the highest average of greenhouse gas emissions, highest level ever seen in history. Here you can see on the graph 1990 to 2019, and we see that the emissions of greenhouse gases continues on the rise. The curve continues upwards. So it's very important to see that we are not on the right path to bring down the emissions. To the opposite, I mean, emissions are increasing. And here I would like to refer to Latin America and the Caribbean, and something that also affects North America. However, our region represents 10% of the greenhouse gas emissions. And what's the overview of these emissions comparing to North America? In North America, the emissions come mostly from fossil fuels, but in our region, they come mostly because of forest felling, fires, and agriculture. So it is a special combination that has to do with the our biomass, and therefore there are growing evidence of climate change, but not to be so pessimistic, because some countries have achieved to bring down their emissions in a consistent manner, limiting warming to 2 degrees. And more than 50 cities have their commitment to reach zero emissions. The results of this climate action, jointly with efficient public policies, have brought down the use of fossil fuels. You have you have wind and solar energies as well. So in other countries, renewable energies are being used, and public policies with renewable energies are reducing emissions in some areas. The important message of working group number 3 says, unless there are immediate and deep reductions of emissions in all sectors, the target of 1.5 degrees is completely impossible to reach. What does emission reduction mean? We would be limiting the warming to 1.5 degrees. And we see that we are on this path since 2020, but to reach that point in 2030, emissions should go down in 43%. So now we are reducing 7% per year. If we limit in 2 degrees centigrade, we would go down less, but to move from 5 to 2 is not easy and has negative consequences. The Ipcc report clearly shows that there are different options in all sectors to bring down the emissions to half before 2030. Industry, services, urban land use, or buildings, transport. But now I would like to speak about land use. This is what happens in our region. Most of the emissions come with a felling of trees and agriculture. And this sector is called FOLU, it's forestry and others. The sector contributes with 22% of global emissions, and in Brazil is 70%. This sector can reduce the emissions as well as can help to sequestrate carbon through protection of natural ecosystems like forests, turfs, wetlands, savannas, and prairies. In Brazil, we have all these systems that need to be carefully managed. However, the message is also important because we need to reduce emissions in all the other sectors of economy. These options for mitigation have, if well planned, can bring lots of benefits to biodiversity and ecosystems, and climate change can be improved and can help to livelihood and food security. This is being well assessed in order to increase the removal of CO2, and this could balance out those emissions that are difficult to remove, for example, of aviation. But, for example, biology, through biological methods, reforesting and carbon sequestration can replace the difficult reduction in other sectors. Once again, we have here the regional potential of mitigation in agriculture and forestry. Latin America and the Caribbean is the region where there is the greatest potential to reduce and improve ecosystems, protecting forests. I'm moving on because time is up. It's important that this sector, representing a high potential of emissions, should be also considered by decision makers. Here, measures are, the idea is to reaching $100 per TCO2 EQ1, and this followed by agriculture and other demand sectors. Here you can see the costs. This is a sector where there is a great potential to reduce emissions, but this at the same time can be achieved with a lower cost than other sectors of the economy. We need to keep on working, removing existing gaps. Here we have the financial flows 3 to 6 times below necessary levels until 2030 to limit the warming to less than 1.5. So we need to reduce these gaps, and these gaps are found in developing countries at global level. I would also like to say something that as Senator Requena said, we need to see those territories where we find the most vulnerable populations. And here in the forests, we should respect knowledge, experience, and the rights of indigenous peoples. And this is crucial. It's important to see that Latin America and the Caribbean forests cover more than 80% of the area occupied by indigenous peoples. We are speaking about 330 million hectares, thus proving the critical role it plays in these efforts. I'm going fast now. We need to reduce barriers existing, and that involves major investments in technology, innovation, and mainly agriculture, policy formulation, and economic systems that will allow for this mitigation in all sectors. We need to see that in speaking about deforestation, we need to focus on those factors that can reduce deforestation. And for that, we need laws. Here we speak about protected areas. I will say something. We'll now close. Accelerated climate action is critical for sustainable development today. Today, we can only develop ourselves if we protect our Earth. In the 2030 agenda and the sustainable development goals, the 7 goals that have to do with the development. Here we see mitigation actions. We need to relate this to SDGs. Prevalence of positive signals when protecting ecosystems. If we have sustainable architecture, or agriculture, I'm sorry, we have several other benefits that will help us reach SDGs. Final message, clear evidence, time to act is now. It's today. In our region, the protection of our biomass, we need to react and act. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you, Professor Mercedes. Professor Marcelo brought to us theory and showed us what can happen. On the other hand, Professor Mercedes showed us what is it that we need to do, what is our job, what we need to do to mitigate and adapt to climate change. Now I would like to invite Dr. Virginia Villarino. She's one of the experts in the subject from Argentina. She has contributed significantly in several reports. She has been working for 15 years in the Business Argentinian Center for Sustainable Development, and she will speak not only about what is the duty of all, but what are the activities to be implemented in order to face climate change. You have the floor, Doctor.
I would like to thank ECLAC for this invitation and also thank all the panelists with whom we are sharing this event. It's a great pleasure to be with you all today. And I was the author of the recent 6th assessment report of the Ipcc, and I worked in working group number 3 related to mitigation of climate change. And in consequence, my presentation will be basically to share with you the main results or the key messages of this chapter that refers to available solutions, the measures, and the enabling necessary conventions in order to reduce emissions in a speedy and profound manner. Some of the key messages of this the sixth report of the Ipcc were recently shared by Dr. Bustamante, so I'm not going to reiterate the contents of that. And in any case, perhaps provide some supplementary points to what Mercedes has already conveyed to us all. Beyond speaking about mitigation in general terms, I would like to focus on what happens in the short and medium term in key areas of our economies and of our societies. If you're unaware of this, unlike the other reports on the impacts of climate change in different places of the world, where they do what the Ipcc focus on is to conduct a more regional analysis in terms of what happens in each region of the world. In this chapter on mitigation actions, this chapter is far more general, far more global, because it would imply talking about technologies, regulations, laws, policies. That would imply practically a case-by-case analysis, a country-by-country analysis, because it would be very difficult to generalize policies or political instruments that are relevant for countries in all parts of the world and in all socioeconomic contexts. So what I would like to do is to share the main messages of the report, which has a much more global outlook, and in accordance with my experience in the region, to add some regional specificities. But I would like to mention that this perspective, this filter for the region, is not necessarily expressed as such in the report that I would like to, in the Ipcc report. What was just shown was the gap that we find ourselves in terms of the trends that at a global level we are dealing with, if we take into consideration the present policies that are underway at present or projected, planned at an international level, which is expressed in the red line, the trend of implemented policies. And if and we can see how in the halfway through the century, we find a greater gap in terms of the reduction of emissions that we should achieve if we wish to limit warming by 2 degrees or by 1.5 degrees, which is represented in the light blue line. What I would like to supplement in this point is that we are not only talking of a gap in terms of the level of ambition with regards to reductions that we must achieve in order to reduce this trend, which is expressed in the from the red line to the blue or light blue line, if we want to achieve that target of 1.5. What we're also talking of implementation gaps, which is also very difficult to deal with, because it would not be enough for us to define in all countries policies and plans that are indeed more ambitious than present ones, but we must also be able to show that those policies and those plans have instruments that are necessary to implement them, which is something that we cannot see at present. These national commitments, these policies are not sufficiently ambitious in terms of their reduction targets, but they're also weak in terms of guaranteeing that those goals, those targets are actually met, are actually achieved. So I would like to add to this gap, the gap that has to do with implementation measures, which is very important in all regions. On top of what we heard previously, I would like to dwell, or I would like to share with you, the main areas or the Ipcc establishes the options that are available in each sector of our society, in each economic sector, in order to reduce global emissions by at least 50% and by 2030. And this reduction points us in the direction of achieving the climatic achievement goal, the climatic goal of 1.5 degree reduction at a technical level, at a technological level. This is possible, and we have the means so that in the short and medium term, well, 2030 is the short term, and you will have to determine what 2030 seems what that means, but we have alternatives that are economically feasible in each one of these sectors. And what I would like to briefly share with you is the main measures that in each sector for the reduction of emissions with this idea of 1.5 degrees in mind. Mercedes already mentioned the use of the issue of land use, so I won't dwell on that, but I will refer to other sectors that are also tremendously relevant for Latin America. Let us think that in the energy sector, and in terms of opportunities, we could say that Latin America has one of the electricity grids which is most clean, with less carbon in the world, and therefore in order to decarbonize our sector, we begin with a very specific situation, which is far better than in other regions of the world. Obviously, the situation in each country in the region is very diverse. We have countries which are practically decarbonized in terms of their energy grid, and others have a greater presence of carbon. But in any case, we have a very advantageous, positive situation. Investment in the generation of infrastructure has grown enormously over the past few years. So I will begin with this very relevant sector, which is the energy sector. And the Ipcc says that in terms of energy transition aligned with the objective of 1.5 degrees, well, energy sectors should increasingly become low emission sectors with zero net carbon levels. And this basically implies, or this objective will rely very heavily on us being able to achieve the electrification of our energy sector, including its final use. It's very important that if we're to do away with carbon or have a low carbon energy grid, final users, the final user sectors at a residential, commercial, industrial, or transport level, well, they will all need to expand the rate of electrification, because that is a way in which we will obviously, and based on a grid with a high percentage of renewable energy, we will be able to provide these sectors that use energy with an energy with low emissions and low carbon. And in addition to electrifying the energy sector, or to increase electrification in final users, energy efficiency will also be a fundamental aspect in the region, in the world as a whole, of course, but in the region, in our region especially. And we have a tremendous gap in terms of making more efficient our generation, but also the final usage of energy. We need to reduce the use of fossil fuels hand in hand with the electrification of final users. So that goes hand in hand with the reduction of fossil fuels. But we are aware, and we know that the way in which each country plans its its energy transition, in many countries it won't be possible to completely eliminate the use of fossil fuels and emissions, to fully abolish that. And therefore, the use of technologies aimed at the capture and storage of carbon will be very relevant in this energy transition, in order to compensate those emissions that the system cannot eliminate by 100%. And what is also fundamental is the role played by alternative fuels in this energy transition, focusing fundamentally on hydrogen. The main focus will be on green hydrogen, the hydrogen that is produced produced as a result of renewable sources, but we also talk about hydrogen with low emissions, such as the one produced by natural gas as a transition fuel with lower emissions. And the biofuels will also need to play a more important role, but we have to guarantee that these fuels, these biofuels, are produced in a sustainable fashion. In other words, that throughout its production cycle, there is a net reduction of emissions. The other two sectors are also very relevant for our region. We're talking of the transport sector and the residential sector, the way in which our urban sectors are planned and built. And these two sectors refer to a greater system, which is the urban system. In our region and in the world, what is very relevant, practically 1/3 of the emissions generated at an international level are generated indeed in urban sectors as a result of all the different services that exist in cities, but also because the world population, and especially the Latin American population, will continue to increasingly be an urban population. In our region and in the world as a whole, we expect that the emissions as a result of these urban sectors will be the main emissions, and that they will continue to grow. Emission rates will continue to grow in these urban sectors, and even per capita emissions of countries in our region may increase by even 40% over the next few years in urban contexts. And therefore, this is very relevant for the region. It is very relevant to understand the measures for these two sectors that, as I said, together with energy services, comprise the emission matrix within a city, within an urban sector. The transport sector is the one that will experience the biggest number of transformations in the next decade or 2 decades, even more perhaps than the energy sector. And the main aspects and the two pillars that mitigation measures must be based on is, first of all, to reduce demand. In other words, to make much more efficient the demand of mobility services, both for people and for goods. And secondly, the focus is also on low carbon technologies with regards to transport and mobility, so that with these two variables, we can dramatically reduce emissions in this sector. And also in terms of low carbon technologies, electrical vehicles play a key role because they have the greatest potential in terms of reducing emissions in this sector, but only if and when this electrification is accompanied by an electricity grid that is also decarbonized with low emissions. Otherwise, it simply implies moving emissions from one sector to the other. So what is fundamental what is fundamental is to have electricity vehicles, but that relies upon energy grids that are able to move those electrical vehicles, are also decarbonized and low carbon sectors. But there's other sectors where this electrification is far more costly, complex, and not necessarily the most efficient, for example, in terms of aviation and in the maritime sector. In these cases, again, alternative fuels are important, such as hydrogen and biofuels. And in this sector, or when it comes to these low carbon technologies in the region, we also have tremendous potential and possibilities in terms of being part of the solution for these sectors. If we think about electrical vehicle technologies in our region, we have, with Chile, Bolivia, and Argentina, the biggest reserves of lithium in the world. And as you know, lithium will be a fundamental to enable this potential of electrification in the transport sector. But we also have an enormous potential and very important projects in the region in terms of green hydrogen and biofuels that we have promoted and that lead this industry in the world, and therefore trying to understand these measures and what they mean in terms of opportunities for the region. In terms of the residential sector, we have a population that will be primarily urban in our region. Today, science tells us that it's possible to achieve zero net emissions in buildings, in residential areas, in commercial sectors, in office buildings, where we live our lives. By 2050, technologies exist for buildings to demand a minimum amount of energy, and that energy be provided by low carbon sources, and that will lead to a decarbonization of this sector. I would like to say that energy efficiency policies will contribute or will be possible to achieve this 50% of this potential to decarbonize the sector. So it's very important to minimize emissions in the residential areas in buildings. So the role of policies of energy efficiency.
Our region involves decarbonizing, and it will be different from the challenge of developed countries. In developing countries, as the case of our region, the focus will be placed mainly in the new building. As urban development rates, new cities, new construction will occur in developing countries, not in already developed countries. In our region, the focus should be placed in how will we build these new buildings? How will the urban development be carried out? Cities, housing for growing population that needs to access those houses, that it be forecasted and concluded in an efficient manner, thinking about the emissions it will generate, because a building that is built today, tomorrow, in 2 years' time will be there for the next 40, 50 years. So it's going to define our level of emissions in the next 4 or 5 decades. However, in developed countries where the urban development rates, buildings have been built. The challenge is one for improving, adapting, updating, modernizing existing buildings for more efficiency. In the industry sector, perhaps in all the regions of the world, it is one of these sectors where it's going to be most challenging to reach zero emissions. There are 2 main axes. One is the opportunities which is the use of materials in a more efficient manner, circular economies, efficient use, recycling, using one material in a sector that is no longer useful there, but could be an input for another supply chain. All this, that the products are underutilized throughout the world and in our regions as well. And here we speak about how to better use, to take these opportunities that will reduce emissions, will reduce costs, will generate better income, will leverage regional supply chains. There are many benefits, synergies, social, economic benefits, and part of improving policies and practices. In many cases, of course, there are barriers in regulations or policies that do not incentivize this most efficient use of resources. And this is a measure that needs to be rapidly taken advantage of. There are other sectors or industries where it's not feasible to reduce emissions. For example, mainly industries of basic materials, cement, iron and steel, chemical products. In these sectors, it's going to be more difficult to reach zero emissions. And that will involve innovating and modifying present productive processes. And those that could produce cement or steel with zero or very low emissions are still in a pilot stage. So there will be a need for the time being in these sectors to resort in transiting towards zero emission or low emission production will need to have medium-term different path and will be based in capture and removal and carbon sequestration, that for the time being, whilst technologies are not at a commercial scale, it won't be possible to reduce to zero in the next 2 decades these emissions. One specific important aspect that includes this Ipcc report that was not included in previous ones is to analyze the role of demand of goods and services in the reduction of emissions. We saw other sectors of supply, but what happens is that citizens or persons through our consumption habits, styles of life, we have a potential of reducing emissions between 40 to 70% in the year 2050. We are approaching the level of emissions that in 2050 to avoid warming beyond 1.5. These changes in lifestyles, in the way we move, we consume, as you can see, they have this enormous impact in reducing emissions, but call for systemic changes in society. I, as a citizen, need to have the choice. How can I move? What transportation means will I use? Public transportation of low emissions, in order for me to decide in an informed manner. If I don't have that choice and I want to choose correctly, but if I don't have that option, that is why we need to have the supply of these low emission goods and services, but at the same time, on the side of the demand, we will need to choose and decide for these styles of life that are low in emissions. The two sides, the two actions that as citizens or consumers have been analyzed, 60 different options and choices of different services, goods on a day-to-day basis, we as citizens need to choose. But here there are two aspects that generate a greater impact. One is the way we use energy in our homes or offices. The main form is being more efficient, deciding for greater technology in our homes, in our offices, leading to less energy consumption. And second is the way we transport, we use transportation. How can we choose our transportation means, the transportation we use or to move every single day? Those are the two changes. This I will go fast because it was already explained by Dr. Bustamante. And as I'm reaching the end of my time. Yes, we are reaching time. If you could please move. Yes, here, the last one, the previous had already been discussed by Mercedes, so I won't repeat. Just to conclude, that it is necessary. We know that, as Dr. Bustamante said, there are many countries in the world that are showing that it is possible to reverse, to reduce, and have development paths and emission reduction compatible with the Paris Accord. There are policies that have been effective, efficient to limit deforestation, to generate renewable energies, but we need to understand how to accelerate all these technical and technological existing measures, and how to accelerate policies, economic instruments that are being effective, efficient in the world in order to close that gap. And therefore, enabling factors that will allow to promote mitigation and accelerate mitigation, these enabling conditions to be implemented in the very, very short term. They need to happen very soon. And these conditions must be in its place for technical measures to be implemented. One, to close the investment gap. We need to triple or multiply by 6 the present flow of funds allocated to mitigation measures throughout the world, especially in the countries of our region. The policies, well-designed policies, regulatory and economic instruments designed as a package of policies that will feed back each other, and not only isolated mitigation policies, because if they are isolated in one sector and not linked to economic development or social policies or access to services, they need to be all linked. Coordination between government, municipal, provincial, national, and society, and coordination among all players of society. It won't be possible for the government alone or civil society alone to accelerate this transition. Coordination between all sectors of government and society. And finally, technology and innovation, not only being able in our region to access technologies existing in each one of the sectors, but also investment and development of our own technologies, generating space and financing for innovation from our region and our countries. That was it. Thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you. Thank you, Doctor, for telling us what we need to do. And that I liked very much your last slide, because that is very much linked to the Ipcc proposals on a major drive for sustainability. And thank you for the work that the Environment Brazilian Committee has done in ecological investment, also working for the standardization, regulations, new behaviors, and the need of resources at the same time. That is something that cannot be isolated or overlooked. A global effort needs to be displayed for financing those measures. I will now give the floor to senators that have already 2 questions. I don't know if Deputy Rodrigo, after Senator Cecilia, would like to present your views, and Senator Jack Wagner will surely have questions. To please be very accurate, very to the point, because we would like to hear panel members. Senator Cecilia, you have the floor. Thank you. Well, firstly, congratulations for this event. Really, it has been so enriching to listen to Marcelo, Mercedes, Virginia. Thank you very much. I will repeat the presentation in order to take note of each thing you've told us. Thank you for all that wealth. My questions, very specific. First one, specially addressed to Marcelo. What is the importance of the additional development of regional climate models? In Los Andes, there are different altitudes or heights, and there is a problem to make forecasts. So I would like to know, what is your view as a scientist of how can we move forward on that, or we know enough in order to adopt decisions? I would like that answer. Now, as to Mercedes and Virginia that have touched on the most complex topics involving society, politics, development that Senator Jack Wagner said. It's a false dichotomy. When do we believe that development can destroy ecosystems, but it is development needs to be for the protection of ecosystems. Bioproductivity is a clear marker. In that framework, I would like to ask, what are the best practices in Latin America that could serve as a basis that we have already done? Please, a couple of examples of best practices. And one last question, sustainable finances. How do you see the issue of sustainable finances? One view, please. How do you envision this concept articulated to all that has been presented? 3 questions. Thank you very much.
If you allow me, I would like to listen to all the questions from everyone, because we have little time available, and subsequently panelists can answer in accordance to their own knowledge. Rodrigo, Deputy, would you like to make a comment or a question? Good morning, everyone. It's a tremendous pleasure to be with you all participating in this event, and I would like to especially greet Senator Jacques Wagner on behalf of researchers and also Mercedes Bustamante. It's a tremendous challenge when we talk about climate change. You have all said that this is a factor which is undeniable. Well, whether these changes are a problem or not, because they are indeed a problem. And this is something that we deal with in all our countries. All our countries have entered into commitments. And likewise in Brazil, we have entered into international commitments. And we also want to achieve certain goals. Countries have entered into these commitments, and in fact, few and some things have been done in terms of implementation in accordance with sectors. This is the case of energy sectors, wind power, for example. In Brazil, wind power produces 21,000 megawatts, practically 11% of the production in Brazil, and biomass also represents 8%, and likewise solar power. And so this sector is growing and developing very clearly. Of course, we have urban populations impacted by extreme events. So we have the issue of water, disasters, droughts, people that suffer from forest fires, and also in terms of agriculture. We know how Latin America is a major producer of food for the world. And we face problems when it comes to the production of food. We also suffer important losses in terms of biodiversity. In Brazil, we have the largest number of losses in our planet. And we will have faced that loss of diversity for a longer period of time, and therefore that is a major challenge for parliaments in the world. Is the implementation for the future will be the most important aspect. How is it that we can reduce the time periods that we have set ourselves, and how is it that cities can adapt to climate change? What is it that we can do to mitigate the effect of changes? Because climate change is already with us. How can we then implement that mitigation? And also, land use changes have been reduced by 40%. And likewise, the issue of deforestation is something that should be analyzed. So rather than discussing the way in which we can change our emissions, but we must prepare for that. And so I would like to especially invite everyone to that, because we need to move on to the issue of implementation. Implementation implies changing our behaviors, and therefore we must have strong public policies that include changes in the legislation applicable to each specific sector. And we must also guarantee the necessary resources so that those changes can actually take place. Many countries represented here have national plans in place also related and they also have objectives related to climate change. But I believe that everyone is behind when it comes to implementation. In Brazil, we continue to destroy forests. We're destroying 500,000 hectares of tropical areas, and also other factors are impacting in this sense. Agriculture has also developed a very interesting program when it comes to the financing of a low carbon agriculture that has achieved very good results. But at the same time, we also have that permanent deforestation and for the appropriation of public land or for the use of agriculture. And therefore, our efforts must be aimed in that direction. And we must therefore move head on towards implementation focused in the most heavily impacted sectors and in those that are most important in terms of gas emissions. So thank you very much for the opportunity. I am very happy to again see our friends, our dear friends who are struggling so that we can face up to such a negative moment for humanity. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Deputy. It is true that the Parliament is the voice of the people. And you also posed a question of another colleague that is following us via YouTube. And that is that the region has very low compliance with regards expectations. In other words, the goal of meeting the Paris Agreement levels and other commitments. So I believe that we must focus now on implementation. And now, panelists, specialists, what are the priorities? How is it that we can improve when it comes to meeting regulations, policies, or perhaps could we think of something much more technological where Latin America could be of help? Mr. Senator Wagner, would you like to ask a question, or can I move on to the panelists? I would like to make a comment. I would like to change the focus of the questions that were asked. I would like to say that in actual fact, as our deputy has already mentioned, the implementation, and Carlos, you also referred to political will. There will be no political will if there is no pressure from society. In Parliament, politicians operate within that sphere. And what do I mean by that? Well, I want to say that I want to ask all three panelists. It's not their mission, but we have to develop that. We need to win a battle in our societies, and especially in Brazilian society. We have a president who talks against all of that. And he has 32% support. But we need to go beyond care, information, and the scientific information provided to us by the three panelists. So it is always said, well, for 75 or 77 years, we have had a good example of that, the birth of fascism in Germany, for example. We must remember that gained power in Germany through elections. And therefore, what I want to say is that we need to call upon the three panelists we must provoke fear in society through positive information. And there's a lot in terms scientific information that says that the meteorites are heading towards our planet and that our planet will explode and so on. If that news was in the newspaper, for example, saying that that meteorite will fall upon the city of Bahia, well, everyone in Bahia will escape and try to live elsewhere. The meteorite will fall upon, will hit the planet and not Bahia, Argentina, or Bolivia. It will be striking our planet. And therefore, we need to be much stronger in terms of building this narrative. We must decode that to establish how far the productivity of agribusiness will drop in 5 or 10 years' time. And based on that, the difficulties in terms of access to drinking water in 4 or 5 years' time, and based on what is happening. In other words, what I'm trying to say is that we have to work on a narrative that is close to common sense, so that we don't wage an ideological battle. I don't want to ask a question. I am simply sharing a reflection with you. Rodrigo correctly mentioned the fact that we need to implement. But in Brazil, what we're doing is to do exactly the opposite. That is what I said at the beginning. And next week, we will be discussing this in Congress. We will be discussing this in the Agriculture Commission, and the President of the Congress provided information to that commission. He didn't send that to the Environmental Commission or to the Social Affairs Commission, and thank God that that is presided by Senator Niemeyer. And next week we will be working with Rodrigo Pacheco. What I want to say here is that we will have to distribute some fear. That asteroid that is falling is practically reaching our planet. That is my own reflection rather than a question. And we could say that in 3 years' time, agribusiness will be lost, that we already have difficulties in terms of gaining access to drinking water, things of that nature. In order to try to provide correct information about what is happening. What was said here is very important, but we are talking among ourselves in our own bubble. And therefore, all of us present in this meeting already have a degree of awareness, and we are already committed to those issues. What we need is to do away with that bubble. We are talking of South America here, and I believe we could still face a tremendous resistance to all these issues. So what I told you about the Brazilian Congress, the law on poison was read in the agriculture, was discussed in the Agriculture Commission this week in our Congress, and we need to we need to translate these issues into a narrative that will enable us to achieve greater commitment on the part of citizens as a whole. Thank you, Senator. This is a tremendously important issue. How to make people feel this in their own lives, so to speak. This is a classical view on the part of economists. And if we talk about the long term, we will all be dead. Well, there is awareness in terms of the world that we're leaving for future generations. And that is the first definition of sustainability. And we cannot when we must provide future generations with opportunities. So now we'll offer the floor to Professor Marcelo.
10 years ago, ECLAC supported a project with INPE of Brazil. And so when the supercomputer for simulating climate change, the INPE model with the European models and Japanese as well. We had to buy a hard drives in order to compete in different models. Today, the technology is new, different. We have greater capacity. Which one of the countries of the region sending one or two experts to work with these models? And then I will give the floor afterwards to Mercedes and Virginia, trying to speak about the priorities in mitigation and what challenges do you have for a region that is highly urban, but also devastating in the rural, as Mercedes. And if you allow me, I add it's a very unequal region, not only in terms of income, but of knowledge, of capacity, education, and knowledge, know-how, because we have a drought in the northeast, there is drought in Chile, there is ice melting of the mountain range and rainfall in the southeast of Brazil. And Jacques, certainly, if I know the base, if there is a meteorite that will fall on the earth, it won't be in Bahia, because it is protected, because it is a very special state. Very interesting, all of this discussion, really. First, we need to trust God and the Orishas. Well, as to the question of the Senator Requena, I'm so pleased she raised it, because it gives me the opportunity to speak about climate models that were used in Ipcc for those forecasts. We are showing global models of 100 by 100 kilometers, and therefore details at regional levels is in places where topography, mountains are complex. There are different types of soil, rapid changes in those soils. That is not duly represented in models. And for that reason, if you want to make forecasts at regional scale, we use the regional thematic models mentioned by Senator. And today, still, there's a lot to be learned, and we need to keep on improving global models and regional models. One of the things that sometimes the message does not arrive, that although there are some conclusions of Ipcc that have been changed in all the reports of Ipcc. One of the typical examples is climate sensitivity, how much the Earth temperature would increase if there is a doubling of concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere vis-a-vis pre-industrial period, to go from 200 to 500 parts per million. Today, we have 417 million parts per million. And that figure has been quite constant, 3 degrees of temperature rise, plus minus 1.5. But in this last Ipcc report, there were models showing greater climate sensitivity, significantly greater, and it was moved to higher values. But it is that is since the 80s to date, but that is a global measure of climate. If we go to the regional component, which is of interest for specific countries, we have learned a lot in the last 30 years what would happen at regional level regarding climate, although at global level, the values have been quite similar. If we go to regional information, the fact that models are ever more complete, there are more processes involved, more space resolution, all that has enabled us to learn a lot about changes observed and changes into the future. And something I would like to highlight is that the knowledge or the improvement of climate models is always accompanied by having better observed databases. With those better observed databases, you can validate the model. So throughout these 30, 40 years, databases we have of rainfall, temperature, climate variables, all that has enabled at regional level to validate models. And that, of course, allows to reduce uncertainty of future forecasts. So we need to improve on climate models. There are still many things that we still don't know about the climate system. We need to investigate physics of climate and incorporate all that to the models we have. That on the one hand, and to answer the concern of Senator Wagner and Deputy Agostinho, I would like to mention an experience I had last week. What I see is that the new generations are extremely sensitive, aware of the climate change problem. The new generations, adolescents, youth, do have a much greater environmental awareness or conscience, greater than what we had at that time. And therefore, I truly see a light of hope. And thus, last week, I participated in a seminar that UNESCO organized to start including the voice of the youth, at least in Uruguay, about the national determined contributions. Every 5 years need to be done by the countries. And the idea is to include the voice of the youth, of the young people in that in those indices. This is a road to be treaded. It is the generation that will inherit the planet. Therefore, they need to have a voice on what we are doing. Along those, that is the important path that we need to move forward along, incorporate them more. And that's it. Thank you, Professor Marcelo. Now, Professor Mercedes, thank you for the questions. Each one of the questions could give rise to a whole seminar. But let us begin with what Senator Cecilia asked about existing best practices in the region. I would like to speak about Brazil that has given examples, set an example as to the use of the earth. There, much progress has been achieved, reducing deforestation of up to 80%. We have participatory governance in several places and also using remote monitoring. There is a policy that has been designed with land governance. This the recipe to be followed. What's important for the region and the use of land is protection of communities and native indigenous peoples that are important for the use of natural resources. There are peoples that would like to reap the benefits of preservation of their territory. When speaking of agriculture, especially agriculture for commodities, we know that this is not national, this is transnational. This involves major multinational companies working throughout the whole world. The transparency of production chains is very important, and maintain the responsibility for the impact. The traceability of productive chains is very important. There, the company should assume a sustainability commitment in countries of origin and countries of destination. For example, the commitments of certain chains not to buy products coming from places where deforestation occurs. Major importing companies are also today obliged to assume the commitment of not buying from areas that are deforesting. As to implementation, and this I've discussed with Senator Wagner. Brazil needs to move to further action. What is it that we should see as to environmental policies when turning the page of our moment of our history, moving to reconstruction? It's going to be difficult because it is in a time of great frailty, but it's important that environmental governance be less susceptible to attacks that can destroy what we have built. I have the feeling today, in times of reconstruction, that we need to rebuild with more solid basis. And all of this has to do with political governance. The fact that politics that is seeking a low carbon time, well, this shows that today we have more resources available in an unrestricted agriculture. But the truth is that we should move towards financing in order to change this situation. Dr. Cecilia spoke about sustainability. Yes, we need to continue on this. Investment funds in the world are moving towards sustainability, and they also need to put their grain of salt in this equation, keep on investing in fossil fuels or predatory activities are no longer acceptable. And to finish, I am facing the everyday problems of climate change for all societies. Sometimes we have apocalyptic messages that will make population leave or be further out. We need to, yes, show that the problem is a serious one, it's critical, but at the same time, there are solutions, there are responses. We can change this, and that this transformation needs to continue in a fair and equitable manner. We won't improve this with poverty, and we won't change poverty if we don't think about climate change. And Marcelo says that there is a promising future. Well, youth need to be included, yes, because they understand what is happening and they are the ones that will receive our planet. This new generation should participate more in what is being done.
Professora Mercedes. Doutora Virginia, por favor.
Muchas gracias, Mercedes. Doctora Virginia. I don't want to repeat the answers, but I will focus on the last question that you asked, Carlos, in terms of the challenges for the region and the challenges when it comes to implementation, that we all agree that that is the main challenge in terms of how to implement what we have promised, at least. And despite the fact that the region faces challenges and gaps in technological aspects, in access to technologies and so on, over and above that, we face a challenge in terms of governance, and that's an institutional level. Because what is working, even in countries in our region, so that we don't necessarily compare ourselves with countries that are very distant to us in terms of cultural and social aspects, the countries that are implementing and making headway with regards to these more ambitious commitments do that via roadmaps, sectorial roadmaps, in order to implement that transition. And these roadmaps, what is unique in them is that they involve a consensus among all stakeholders, both public and private, that must play a role in the transformation of the industrial sector, in the transformation of the transport system, in the energy sector. But in many of our countries, we have transition plans in place, energy plans, and so on. Those are all there, but they are not being put into practice. And where they work is where these plans emerged, not from a single stakeholder or from the state level, but were the result of long-term work and in terms of arriving at a consensus with different perspectives, because this transition will lead to winners, to losers. As for some, it will be very positive. For others, it will have negative impacts. And because of what you said, Carlos, in the sense that our region is very unequal. And for that reason, this transition has to be very well planned. The safeguarding social and economic impacts for all different stakeholders in our countries, the synergies between the mitigation or mitigation technology options and the social and economic co-benefits will not appear naturally. They will not be the result they will not simply exist because they exist. They have to be planned and agreed by the different stakeholders that will form part of transitions in all sectors. And that exercise, at least in many countries, perhaps not all of them, but in many countries of the region, and Argentina is certainly an example of that, well, we don't have an experience in terms of that long-term experience of long-term planning with among stakeholders that have different visions and that can be translated into concrete issues such as regulations, economic measures, and so on. So the Ipcc, in fact, says that what will be required is to have solid, strong, and transparent institutions in place so that this transition may be a just transition. Otherwise, this will not be beneficial to society as a whole. And I believe that that is the biggest challenge, a more cultural and institutional type of challenge. And the last aspect in terms of financing that I would like to answer to Cecilia is that in our council, our membership is corporations. And just like the senator said, well, we have to speak to people in a different code. We need to translate this to what is important for people. Well, we do that exactly to corporations, and we translate all this in terms of business issues, why it is important for them, why it is important for them to have ambitious science-based goals in mind. And one of the most important aspects that is useful for us to convince them is the international financial system. And that is how the international financial system today is a relevant stakeholder for this transition, because at last, They are now fully involved in this agenda, and more than 2/3 of the market capitalization at an international level seeks today to devote funds and financing to companies, to corporations, or projects that ensure that they will be aligned to science-based goals, linked to the reduction of these emissions linked to the Paris Agreement. And most initiatives have to do with an initiative based on the United Nations that has defined that those corporations, sectors, companies that wish to receive this financing to achieve decarbonization in line with the Paris Agreement will certainly obtain financing. And those that do not act in this fashion will find it very difficult to gain access to any funds. And that is a reality that we are evidencing everywhere, and also in countries in our region, not only in Switzerland and other countries. The financial sector today is a key stakeholder when it comes to accelerating this transition, and that is something that is very clear for corporations of our private sector in our region. Thank you, Dr. Virginia. This is something that we have to have very present in terms of how capital operates in the financial sector, which is already incorporating the climatic variables, risks, and problems of this nature are already evident. And in the past, we spoke about the shared responsibilities with countries, but obviously the responsibility is also shared by investors, and society will charge these financial expenditure when it comes to negative impacts. So now I'd like to offer the floor to Senator Cecilia so that she can share her closing words. And we thank her for promoting this webinar and for her work in Bolivia and in our region as a whole. And after that, Senator Wagner can offer his closing remarks. Thank you, Carlos, and everyone. And once again, I would like to thank Professor Marcelo Barreiro, Mercedes Bustamante, and Virginia Vilariño, because they have truly enriched our day. I have been following these issues for many days, and I have learned enormously today, and I truly thank you for that. And I hope that everyone that have listened to this and that will listen to this, because this will be online, will be able to enrich themselves through this very inspiring dialogue. And that is a key aspect to undertake urgent, relevant, and in-depth and articulated action, articulated in this case between science, academia, and politics, and especially the more representative politics, which is often left aside. It's normally the executive that reigns when it comes to these issues, and that's okay, but we need far more than that, because we need a convergence of a larger amount of wills, and that is why Virginia clearly mentioned governance. We need that consensus, we need that articulation and that clarity, as mentioned by many of you. And very modestly, I would like to say that this event contributes to that because it enables many other events of this nature. This is so that we can undertake this task in increasingly more effective fashion to achieve this cultural and institutional change.
Par de mensajes que son dicotómicos, aparentemente dicotómicos, pero fundamentales, que es que tenemos las herramientas para reducir en 43%.
To be reduce our emissions by 43% by 2030. So it's not that we don't know how to do this. We know how this can be done. And since we know how this can be done, we should be able to do this. It's not easy. The synergies are dramatic, tremendous, complex, and even worse in context of inequality, as has been mentioned here. But the point is that we can do this. It's clear that if we don't do this, this would be very, very severe. So we have a civilizing challenge in front of us with a magnitude that humanity has not had to face in the past. And we do have to face this head on. And therefore, we have to try to do everything that we can all do as from our own positions. We will not be able to be successful with this alone. We need to be articulated. And therefore, this message of the 2 points of this situation are fundamental as a conclusion for today's event. I would also like to highlight something which is fundamental for our region in Latin America, which is the source of CO2 emissions, which is primarily linked to changes in use of land. And in the Amazon region, deforestation, as Professor Mercedes said, implies a violation of the rights and ethnocide, a true ethnocide of indigenous populations. And this is, in the case of Bolivia, the same problem connected to protected areas. And therefore, we need to tackle this component of this whole system that we have been talking about, which has direct connections with water, as has been explained by Marcelo, but also linked to food. And today we are facing a food crisis, and we are and yet we're not changing food production systems, which is something that we must do in our region. I have heard very interesting aspects about perennial crops. I know that there's also solutions in other spheres that we should take into consideration, but this also implies a much more wider ranging issue related to human security. The Amazon region, for example, is a region which is outside the law, where social violence is brutal in many of our countries. And therefore, I believe that none of the countries in the Amazon basin is free of this, nor is my country. And I would like to conclude by saying that what is very important, and something that has not been mentioned here, that is implicit, but I would like to express this explicitly, is the importance of struggling for protected areas and indigenous populations and Ramsar territories. In our country, despite the discourse, they face a tremendous risk because there are contradictions in terms of the narrative, to use a fundamental term used by Senator Jacques Wagner, the narrative. Many people are being told in Bolivia that the protection of forests, of protected areas, is to protect them for the gringos. And please excuse me for this colloquial language, but that is exactly as it is expressed. What is not understood is the importance of protecting forests and other ecosystems protected by protected areas for the immediate well-being of the population of Latin America, and especially of very vulnerable populations. Therefore, what is fundamental is that struggle, and we're waging that struggle, but that struggle is in the biggest context that was mentioned here. And once again, I would like to thank each one of the panelists. Thank you very much. I would like to mention this. It's very nice to work together with Senator Wagner. I hope we will be able to incorporate many other congressmen and women from the region, such as Senator Gladys from Argentina, who has been behind this Parliamentary Observatory on Climate Change and Just Transition, which is so important and which would not exist without the support of ECLAC. So thank you very much for everyone that has contributed to this. I can't mention everyone. I think we've run out of time, so I end up with these words. Thank you very much, and see you next time. Thank you, Senator Cecilia, for your words. I would also like to thank the presence of Deputy Rodrigo Agostinho, who was also present with us, Senator Jacques also, who has had to leave. But the closing words will be by Senator Cecilia, who also spoke about major challenges. And I thank the panelists and all the activities of the Ipcc. And this is in the ECLAC site. It is in online and not only this video, but all the other activities that we will be holding. So we will be together in this. ECLAC is very interested in supporting this. That creation of awareness and the sharing of knowledge, and we need to aim at towards a consensus, because a law is basically the consensus of a societal consensus. So thank you very much, everyone. An excellent day for everyone. And so we will meet again with Professor Marcelo, Virginia, Mercedes. We need to know much more, and you are indeed our sources. So thank you very much for your work, and hopefully see you very soon. Goodbye.
Gracias.
Gracias.